I saw my husband's car at my daughter-in-law's house, and what I heard destroyed me. I thought it was just a quick visit, but something wouldn't leave me in peace. I looked through the curtain and saw them together and heard things I wouldn't wish on anyone. In that instant, my whole world collapsed, but I swore they would pay for every lie, and I began gathering evidence in silence. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. We continue. I promise this will be the best story you'll ever hear in your life. Helen adjusted her reading glasses while correcting the last English exercises. 43 years of teaching, and she still felt the same satisfaction seeing her students' progress. The afternoon light gently entered through the living room window, illuminating walls filled with family photographs. She breathed deeply, feeling that peace that only a well-established routine provides. On the shelf beside her, the photo from her 40th wedding anniversary with Anthony. Her solid relationship built on small daily gestures. Coffee brought to bed on Sundays, shirts always impeccably ironed, loving notes left on the refrigerator door. Small demonstrations that, added together, formed the structure of a well-lived life. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. "Hello, Grandma? It's Beth." The excited voice of her 8-year-old granddaughter made Helen smile instantly. "Hi, sweetheart, how was school today? I made a super pretty drawing. Grandma, will you pick me up tomorrow? Please, please." Helen laughed at the girl's insistence. "Of course, I'll bring those cinnamon cookies you love. The star-shaped ones. Yay! I love you, Grandma." The call ended, leaving in the air that comforting feeling that only a child's love provides. Helen marked on the kitchen calendar, "Pick up Beth, 3 p.m. Next to it was another note, "Special dinner, 7 p.m. A reminder for the wedding anniversary they would celebrate the following week. The clock showed almost 6 in the evening when Helen decided to prepare dinner. Anthony would arrive soon from the real estate agency, where he had worked for over 30 years. The house was quiet. Only the clinking of cutlery and the low sound of the radio filled the space. Suddenly, she remembered the present she had bought for her granddaughter, a children's book about a grandmother who taught her granddaughter how to cook, perfect for the Sundays they spent together. "The present!" she exclaimed, remembering she had forgotten to wrap it. She looked at the clock again. There was time to go to her son's house before Anthony arrived. Richard lived only 10 minutes away by car, and she could leave the present with Marcia, her daughter-in-law, for Beth to receive the next day. She grabbed her car keys and drove calmly through the tree-lined streets of the neighborhood. The June evening brought that pleasant breeze typical of San Francisco's mild winter. She parked a block away, enjoying the walk. As she turned the corner, however, something caught her attention. Anthony's car was parked in front of their son's house. Helen frowned, confused. Anthony had mentioned an important meeting with clients that afternoon, something that would make him come home later. What was he doing at Richard and Marcia's house without telling her? A slight discomfort settled in her chest, but she tried to push it away. He must have stopped by to resolve something with Richard, she thought, trying to calm the sudden uneasiness. She approached the house unhurriedly, the present in hand. The living room curtains were partially closed, but a gap allowed her to see inside. She didn't intend to spy, but something made her stop before ringing the doorbell. Through the small space between the curtains, she saw Anthony and Marcia sitting side by side on the sofa, with various papers scattered on the coffee table. The scene in itself wouldn't be alarming. Her husband and daughter-in-law could be discussing any family matter, perhaps issues related to Beth's school, or even preparations for a surprise birthday party. But there was something in their posture, the proximity, the intimacy in the way they leaned over the documents, that seemed out of place, inappropriate. Helen took a step back, suddenly feeling like an intruder. It was then that she heard through the partially open window, "Helen will never suspect a thing." Anthony's voice sounded clear, with a confidence that made her shudder. "She believes everything I tell her. 40 years of marriage, and she still thinks we're living a fairy tale." Marcia laughed, a sound Helen had never heard before, not the cordial laugh from family gatherings, but something complicit, almost malicious. "And Richard? Do you think he would notice anything?" "Richard is too busy with work. He barely has time for his own daughter, let alone to investigate what we're doing." Anthony's voice had a tone of disdain that Helen had never heard. "We need to be smart about the property transfers. The separation has to seem legitimate, something that happened naturally." "Separation?" Helen almost let the question escape aloud, covering her mouth with her hand. "What about the joint savings?" asked Marcia, now in a lower voice. "I've already started transferring small amounts. Helen never checks the statements. She's too old to understand this online banking stuff." Each word was like a sharp blade, cutting through 40 years of trust in seconds. Helen felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She backed up a few more steps, almost tripping on the sidewalk. The children's book she was holding slipped from her trembling fingers, falling with a dull thud on the ground. The sound seemed to alert the two inside the house. She heard footsteps approaching the window. With her heart racing, Helen quickly picked up the book and hid behind a tree. Through the leaves, she saw Marcia slightly pull back the curtain and look outside before closing it completely. The way back home was made in a state of numbness. Helen's hands trembled on the steering wheel as fragments of the conversation echoed in her mind. Simulated separation, transfer of assets, too old to understand. Words that made no sense in the universe she believed she inhabited until minutes ago. Upon arriving home, she found it exactly as she had left it. Dinner half prepared, the radio still playing. But everything seemed different now, as if she were observing through broken glass. The photographs on the wall, once symbols of happiness, now seemed fake, staged. Anthony's daily small gestures, which she interpreted as affection, could be just strategies to keep her distracted. Helen sat in the kitchen chair, the children's book still in her hands. The story of a grandmother teaching her granddaughter, a story of trust and genuine love. She opened it distractedly, and her eyes fell on a phrase: "True love reveals itself in moments of storm." An hour later, she heard the noise of Anthony's car parking in the garage. She took a deep breath. She needed to think. She couldn't confront him now, not without fully understanding what was happening. If she had learned anything in 4 decades as a teacher, it was that knowledge is power. And at this moment, she needed more information. The kitchen door opened and Anthony entered, smiling as always. "Hi, dear. Sorry I'm late. The meeting with clients went longer than expected." He kissed the top of her head, as he did every day. Are you making that lasagna I love?" Helen felt a bitter taste in her mouth, but forced a smile. "Yes, I thought you deserved something special after such a long workday." The words came naturally, as if spoken by someone else. "You're amazing, you know that?" Anthony opened the refrigerator, grabbing a beer. "How was your day? Any news with the students?" "Nothing extraordinary," she replied, watching him carefully. "And your meeting, was it productive?" "Very." He took a sip of beer. "We closed an important deal, but the details are tedious. I don't want to bore you with that." Bore. The word echoed in Helen's mind. How many times had he avoided sharing aspects of his work with that same excuse? How many times had she accepted remaining in ignorance, trusting that he was simply sparing her from complex matters? That night, lying next to the husband who now seemed like a stranger, Helen made a decision. She wouldn't confront him. Not yet. First, she needed to understand the extent of the betrayal. She needed evidence, certainties, and above all, she needed a plan. While Anthony slept deeply beside her, she remained awake, mentally reviewing every moment of the past few months. Small signs she had ignored, calls answered in another room, last-minute meetings, bank statements she no longer checked, the seemingly innocent closeness between Anthony and Marcia during family lunches. For the first time in 40 years, Helen felt truly alone. The initial shock had transformed into a dull, constant pain. But beneath that pain, something else was growing. Determination. She would not be the passive victim they expected. If they wanted war, they were challenging the wrong person. The next morning, Helen got up before her husband. She prepared coffee as she always did, but her mind was working in another direction. She needed help, someone she could totally trust. Her first thought was Elise, her younger sister, but she quickly dismissed that. Elise was too impulsive. She could complicate the situation even more. It was then that she remembered Patricia, a former student to whom she had given private lessons a few years ago. The young woman now worked in technology and always told Helen she could count on her for anything. Perhaps it was time to accept that offer. Helen took the phone and sent a simple message. "Patricia, we need to talk. It's personal and urgent. Can we meet today?" The response came almost immediately. "Of course, teacher. At the cafe near your house at 10 a.m.? "Perfect," replied Helen, feeling for the first time in 24 hours that she wasn't completely adrift. Anthony came down the stairs, adjusting his tie. "Good morning, love. I slept like a rock," he commented, serving himself coffee. Helen observed her husband with new eyes. How could he seem so normal, so much like the man she believed she knew, while planning to destroy everything they had built together? "I have a private lesson today," she lied with surprising ease. "I'll be back in the afternoon to pick up Beth from school." "Oh yes, Friday is Grandma's day to pick up the granddaughter." He smiled, a smile that now seemed empty to Helen. "Give her a kiss from me." "I will," she promised, thinking of her granddaughter, the only certainty of true love that still remained. At 10 o'clock, Helen was sitting in the cafe waiting for Patricia. Her heart was beating fast, torn between the shame of exposing her situation and the desperate need for help. When the young woman with short hair and thick-framed glasses entered the establishment, Helen waved discreetly. "Teacher Helen, it's so good to see you." Patricia hugged her with genuine affection before sitting down. "I was worried about your message. What happened?" Helen took a deep breath, looked into the eyes of her former student and let the words come out. "Patricia, I need your help. I discovered that my husband and my daughter-in-law are planning to deceive me. I need to learn how to collect evidence of this." Patricia's expression instantly changed from concern to indignation and then to determination. "Count on me, teacher. We'll solve this together." At that moment, Helen felt she had taken the first step toward regaining control of her own life. The web of lies would begin to unravel, thread by thread, until nothing remained but the truth. The morning coffee with Patricia extended for almost 2 hours. The young woman listened attentively without judgments, while Helen narrated with a choked voice what she had discovered. "Teacher, what they're doing is not just an emotional betrayal, it's also a crime." Patricia adjusted her glasses, her face serious. "It's attempted fraud, concealment of assets. We need to record everything." Helen lowered her eyes to her cup of tea, now cold. "How do I do that? I've never been good with technology. Anthony always took care of that part." "Exactly what he wanted you to think." Patricia took a small, rectangular device from her bag. "This is a digital recorder, small enough to fit in a coat pocket or in a purse. I'll teach you how to use it." In the following minutes, Patricia showed Helen how to operate the device, how to transfer the files to the computer, and how to store them in a secure cloud location, away from her husband's prying eyes. "I'll also teach you how to take screenshots of bank statements, discreetly photograph documents, and recover deleted messages from your phone, if necessary." Patricia spoke with a confidence that Helen envied. "And we'll create a new email address that only you will have access to store all this evidence." The retired teacher felt a mixture of gratitude and determination growing inside her. "Thank you, Patricia. I don't know what I would do without you." "You taught me much more than English, Teacher Helen." The young woman held her hands. "You taught me integrity. Now it's my turn to give back." Upon leaving the cafe, Helen felt different. The weight of betrayal was still there, but now there was a purpose, a path to follow. She looked at her watch. She still had a few hours before picking up Beth from school. She decided to start her investigation immediately. Her first destination was the bank. With the excuse of updating her registration information, she requested statements from the last 6 months of the joint account. The clerk, a friendly young woman, didn't question when Helen asked to take them printed, instead of receiving them by email. "My computer is having problems," she justified, with a cordial smile that didn't reveal the internal turmoil. In the car, Helen quickly examined the statements. There they were, exactly as Anthony had told Marcia. Small regular transfers to an unknown account. Amounts that individually wouldn't draw attention, but that added up over the months represented a considerable sum. She photographed each page with her cell phone, following Patricia's instructions. Her next step was bolder. She returned home, making sure Anthony would still be at work. She went straight to his office, a room she rarely frequented out of respect for his personal space. Now that consideration seemed ridiculous. With rubber gloves borrowed from the kitchen, she began to methodically examine each drawer, each folder. In the third drawer of the desk, hidden under real estate catalogs, she found a black folder with documents she didn't recognize. Contracts for buying and selling properties she didn't know they owned. Statements from a bank account in Anthony's name only, and most disturbing, a draft of a divorce agreement with clauses clearly unfavorable to her. With trembling hands, Helen photographed each document, ensuring every detail was visible. She replaced everything exactly as she had found it, making sure not to leave traces of her search. Before leaving the office, she noticed something in the trash can, a crumpled paper with Marcia's handwriting. It was a list of furniture with values noted beside them. She recognized some items from her own house. She photographed that as well. When she finished, Helen felt exhausted, as if she had run a marathon, but there was no time for rest. She needed to compose herself before picking up Beth from school. On the way to her granddaughter's school, Helen tried to organize her thoughts. The evidence was clear. Anthony and Marcia were planning not just an emotional betrayal, but an elaborate financial scam. And Richard, her son, was he involved too? The mere possibility made her stomach turn. Upon arriving at the school, she forced a smile. She wouldn't let this situation affect her relationship with her granddaughter. Beth ran toward her as soon as she saw her, hugging her legs enthusiastically. "Grandma, did you bring the cookies?" Helen laughed, a genuine laugh for the first time that day. "Of course, little star. They're in my bag." As they walked hand in hand to the car, Beth chatted about her day at school. Helen listened attentively, grateful for this moment of normalcy amidst the chaos her life had become. "Grandma, look what I drew today." Beth opened her backpack and took out a colorful sheet of paper. Helen's heart froze when she saw the drawing. It was a simple representation, as would be expected from an 8-year-old child, but unmistakably disturbing. An elderly female figure, clearly Helen, was distanced, with tears in her eyes, while the rest of the family, Anthony, Richard, Marcia, and Beth, formed a united, smiling group. It's beautiful, dear," Helen managed to say, her voice failing. "But why is Grandma crying here?" Beth shrugged with the typical innocence of childhood. "I don't know. It just seems that sometimes you're sad, even when you smile, like at that Sunday lunch, when Dad and Grandpa were talking about a trip and you were very quiet." Her granddaughter's perception hit Helen like a punch. Even a child could feel that something was wrong. That piece of paper instantly transformed into the symbol of everything that was at stake, not just her assets, but the place she occupied in the family, the image she would leave for her granddaughter. "May I keep this drawing, Beth?" she asked, carefully folding it. "Of course, Grandma, I made it for you." On the way to Richard and Marcia's house, Helen decided to add another piece to her plan. She called her son, asking if she could keep Beth until dinner. "Of course, Mom. Actually, that would be great. Marcia has a meeting this afternoon and I'm swamped with work." "No problem, son. I'm happy to help." She hung up the phone with a lump in her throat. Did Richard know? Was he consciously allowing his wife and his father to plot behind his back? Helen took Beth for a walk in the park, followed by a snack at the girl's favorite ice cream shop. She observed each smile, each animated gesture, wondering how to protect that child from the earthquake that was coming. Back at her house, Helen helped Beth with her homework, while keeping the recorder turned on in her coat pocket. Perhaps her granddaughter, in her innocence, would let slip some revealing information about conversations she might have heard at home. "Beth, does Grandpa visit your house a lot when I'm not there?" The girl bit her pencil, thoughtful. "Sometimes. He and Mom talk quietly in the office. Once I wanted to go in, but Mom closed the door and said they were adult matters." Helen felt a chill. "And was your dad there during these conversations?" "No, Daddy works a lot. He's almost never home when Grandpa visits." The confirmation was painful, but necessary. Richard probably didn't know what was happening under his own roof. At 6 in the evening, Helen took Beth back home. Marcia had not yet returned from her meeting, and Richard seemed exhausted when he opened the door. "Thanks, Mom. I don't know what we'd do without you." Helen hugged her son tightly, fighting the urge to tell him everything at that moment. It wasn't the time. She needed more evidence, a complete plan. "Son, is everything okay between you and Marcia?" she asked, trying to test the waters. Richard seemed surprised by the question. "Yes, of course. Why?" "Nothing specific. I just noticed that you two seem distant lately." He sighed, running his hand through his hair, a gesture he had made since childhood when he was worried. "We work a lot, Mum. Sometimes it's hard to connect, but we're okay." Helen nodded, not pressing further. She kissed her granddaughter's forehead, promising to return soon, and left with an even heavier heart. Her son was completely oblivious to the storm that was forming. Back home, she found Anthony watching television, seemingly relaxed. How could he appear so normal while destroying everything they had built. "How was the day with Beth?" he asked, smiling. "Wonderful, as always." Helen sat in her usual armchair, discreetly turning on the recorder in her pocket. "Anthony, I was thinking maybe we should review our will. Beth is growing up, and I want to make sure her future is secure." Anthony's expression changed subtly, a flash of alertness that Helen wouldn't have noticed if she hadn't been looking for it. "We can look at that after the wedding anniversary," he replied, turning his eyes back to the television. "I don't like to think about these things during times of celebration." "Of course, you're right," Helen agreed, noticing how he skillfully avoided the subject. "Speaking of which, how are the preparations for our anniversary trip coming along?" Anthony seemed momentarily confused. "Trip? Yes, you mentioned a few weeks ago that you were organizing a surprise for our anniversary. I thought it was a trip." "Oh, that!" he laughed, recovering quickly. "I wanted to keep the surprise, but since you brought it up, yes, I'm planning something special." A lie. Helen knew there was no plan at all, but she let it pass. Each recorded lie was one more piece of evidence in her favor. In the following days, Helen continued her silent investigation. She installed a monitoring application on the computer they shared, following Patricia's detailed instructions. She learned to check Anthony's browsing history and discovered searches for divorce without property division and property transfer without taxes. On a particularly revealing morning, she found in the pocket of one of Anthony's jackets a receipt from an expensive restaurant, dated on a day when he was supposedly at a real estate convention in another city. She cross-checked the dates and realized it was the same day Marcia had told Richard she would be attending a marketing workshop. Helen photographed the receipt and added it to her growing collection of evidence. With each new discovery, the initial pain gave way to a cold, calculated anger. She would not be the defenseless victim they imagined. The riskiest moment of her investigation came when she was almost discovered trying to record a conversation between Anthony and Marcia in the backyard of her own house. They had arranged a family lunch, and Helen noticed when the two moved away to admire the new rose bushes. She followed them discreetly with the recorder, but a broken twig under her feet alerted Anthony. "Helen, what are you doing behind the rose bushes?" he asked, clearly alarmed. "I thought I saw a hummingbird," she responded promptly, smiling. "You know how I love watching them." Marcia looked at her suspiciously, but said nothing. Helen realized at that moment that her daughter-in-law was beginning to suspect. She would need to be even more careful. The situation became even more complicated with the constant presence of Mrs. Eunice, the neighbor known for her insatiable curiosity. The elderly lady seemed to always appear at the most inconvenient moments, asking questions about the unusual movement in the house. "Helen, dear, I saw your husband leaving very early yesterday. Work or something more interesting?" she asked one morning, leaning over the fence that separated the yards. "Work, Eunice? Always work." Helen forced a smile, aware that any change in her behavior would be noticed and, inevitably, commented on throughout the entire neighborhood. Maintaining appearances became more difficult each day. Helen felt like she was living a double life: the dedicated wife everyone knew, and the determined investigator who worked in the shadows. Her only escape valve was Elise, her younger sister. After weeks of keeping the secret, Helen finally confided in her during a coffee at her sister's house. "That bastard, and that gold digger," Elise exploded, knocking over her coffee cup. "Let's confront them right now. I have a lawyer cousin who will destroy them." "Calm down, Elise." Helen held her sister's hands. "I need to do this the right way. If we act impulsively, I could lose everything." "But Helen, they've been mocking you for months. How can you maintain this calm?" "It's not calm, it's strategy." Helen adjusted her glasses. "I've learned a lot in these weeks. I know exactly what I need to do." Elise took a deep breath, still visibly indignant. "At least let me help somehow." "You can help by staying silent. No one can know about this yet, understand? Especially Richard." The mention of her nephew made Elise frown. "Do you think he really doesn't know anything?" The question hung in the air. It was the doubt that had tormented Helen from the beginning. Was it possible that her own son was involved in the betrayal? "I don't know, Elise. I want to believe not. But I'm no longer sure of anything." That night, upon returning home, Helen found Anthony in his office, talking on the phone in a low voice. She approached the half-open door silently, the recorder already on. "We need to accelerate," he was saying. "Helen has been asking strange questions about the will, about our anniversary trip. I think she's suspicious." A pause as he listened to the response on the other end. "No, I don't think she knows, but we can't risk it. The lawyer said the divorce papers will be ready next week. The sooner we resolve this, the better." Helen felt her heart accelerate. Time was running out. She needed to complete her investigation and finalize her plan before Anthony took the next step. The next morning, she did something she had postponed for weeks. She scheduled a consultation with a lawyer. Not just any lawyer, but Dr. Paul Matthews, a specialist in family law, recommended by Patricia. "Mrs. Helen, based on what you've told me and the evidence you've gathered, we have a solid case," stated Dr. Matthews, after carefully reviewing all the documents and recordings. "Your husband and your daughter-in-law are clearly trying to defraud the division of assets. This is a crime." "What are my options?" asked Helen, her hands firmly interlaced on her lap. "We can file a lawsuit for attempted fraud, concealment of assets, and moral damages. With the evidence you've gathered, it's almost certain we'll win, but it will be a long and painful process. The whole story will come out, including your daughter-in-law's involvement. Your family will never be the same." Helen closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing Beth's drawing, the crying grandmother, separated from the family. "Is there another option?" Dr. Matthews leaned forward. "We can try an extrajudicial agreement, confront them with the evidence and propose terms. If they accept, we avoid the public scandal. And if they don't accept, then we proceed with the formal process." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Helen, the decision is yours. But whatever it is, I suggest you act quickly. From the recording I heard, they intend to accelerate their plans." Helen nodded, a renewed determination growing inside her. "I'll think about the options, Dr. Matthews. In the meantime, continue preparing the case. I want to be ready for any scenario." Upon leaving the lawyer's office, Helen felt stronger than she had felt in weeks. The retired teacher, whom everyone underestimated, was about to give the most important lesson of her career, a lesson about consequences. The day of the wedding anniversary arrived, ironically perfect for the plan Helen had devised. 41 years of union celebrated with a performance worthy of an award. Anthony had suggested dinner at the restaurant where they had met, an idea that in other times would have moved Helen. Now she recognized the gesture for what it really was, another strategy to maintain appearances. 41 years, my love." Anthony raised his wineglass, smiling at Helen from across the table. "Who would have thought that young teacher who spilled coffee on my suit would become the love of my life?" Helen smiled, studying her husband's micro-expressions, the way his eyes didn't accompany the smile, the way his fingers nervously drummed on the table. Details that previously went unnoticed now screamed the truth. 41 years of companionship, respect and honesty. Helen emphasized the last word, observing a brief flash of discomfort in Anthony's eyes. Not all couples can be proud of that, can they? Certainly not. He took a sip of wine, slightly averting his gaze. "We are privileged. You know what I was thinking today?" Helen leaned slightly forward, keeping her voice light, "about how we built our assets together, brick by brick. The house, the investments, all the fruit of our joint work." Anthony cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "Helen, today is a day to celebrate love, not to talk about material possessions." "You're right, dear." She strategically retreated. "Speaking of celebration, I was thinking of organizing a special lunch on Sunday, the whole family together like in the old days." "Sunday?" Anthony seemed to mentally calculate something. "I think I have a commitment. I'm sure you can reschedule." Helen smiled sweetly. "I already spoke with Richard and Marcia," they confirmed. "Even Elise will come with the children." Cornered, Anthony nodded. "Of course, dear. It will be a pleasure." That night, lying next to the man who was planning to betray her, Helen mentally finalized every detail of her plan. Sunday's lunch would be the last observation, the final confirmation she needed before the decisive confrontation. Sunday arrived with a flawless blue sky, as if nature itself was conspiring in Helen's favor. She had spent the entire morning preparing each family member's favorite dishes: the chicken with okra that Richard had loved since childhood, the potato salad that made Beth's eyes shine, the milk pudding that was Elise's weakness. At 1 o'clock, the family began to arrive. Richard and Marcia came with Beth, who immediately ran to hug her grandmother. Helen noticed how Marcia seemed tense, smiling mechanically while greeting her mother-in-law. "What a wonderful perfume, Marcia," Helen commented casually. "New?" "Yes. I got it from a friend," Marcia replied, avoiding looking directly at Anthony, who was entering the room at that moment. Helen smiled internally. The perfume was unmistakable. The same one she had found in the glove compartment of Anthony's car 2 weeks earlier. Another confirmation, as if she still needed it. Elise arrived minutes later, casting murderous looks at Anthony and Marcia, which Helen tried to neutralize with a slight nod. Her sister had promised to behave, but her impulsive nature always represented a risk. The lunch proceeded in an apparently normal atmosphere, although Helen could feel the underlying tension. She carefully observed each interaction between Anthony and Marcia. The furtive glances, the phrases with double meanings, the excessive care not to get too close to each other. "So, Marcia, how is that special project you mentioned going?" asked Helen during dessert, knowing exactly the effect her words would have. Marcia froze with the pudding spoon halfway to her mouth. "Project?" "Yes. Richard commented that you were working on something important that required many meetings." Helen maintained an innocent tone while watching panic grow in her daughter-in-law's eyes. "Oh, yes," Marcia recovered, casting a quick glance at Anthony. "It's a marketing project. Nothing very interesting to discuss during lunch." "On the contrary, I find it fascinating," Helen insisted, noting how Richard seemed genuinely confused. "Especially because my husband seems so interested in marketing lately. Isn't that right, Anthony?" An uncomfortable silence fell over the table. Elise coughed to disguise a laugh, while Richard looked from his wife to his father, trying to understand what was happening. "I think the pudding is a bit too sweet," Anthony commented, abruptly changing the subject. "Beth, dear, tell Grandma about your new school project." Helen allowed the change of subject, satisfied with what she had observed. The tension between Anthony and Marcia was palpable, and more importantly, the confusion on Richard's face confirmed her suspicion that her son was not involved in the plot. After lunch, while the children played in the backyard and the adults chatted in the living room, Helen discreetly approached her son. "Richard, can we talk privately tomorrow? I have an important matter to discuss." He seemed surprised but nodded. "Of course, Mom. Did something happen? Nothing to worry about now." Helen smiled, lightly squeezing her son's arm. "Just reserve some time for me, okay?" When everyone left, Helen sat in her favorite armchair, watching Anthony nervously clean his glasses, a habit he had when he was anxious. "It was a pleasant lunch, wasn't it?" she commented, savoring the moment. "Yes, very good," Anthony responded distractedly. "Helen, I need to resolve some things at the office tonight. Don't wait up for me." "On Sunday?" Helen raised her eyebrows. "Must be something very important." "It's just paperwork." He avoided her gaze. "You know how these things are." "Yes, I know exactly how these things are," Helen murmured to herself as her husband hurriedly left the room. As soon as she heard the car leave, Helen picked up the phone and dialed Dr. Matthews' number. "Is everything ready for tomorrow, Doctor?" "Yes, Mrs. Helen, all documents are prepared as we discussed." "Excellent. Time for the final phase." The next morning, Helen got up early. Anthony had returned late the night before, smelling of women's perfume and expensive whiskey. Helen had pretended to be asleep when he lay down, controlling the anger growing inside her. While preparing coffee, she received a message from Patricia. Everything ready as planned. Strength teacher. At 9 o'clock, she called the bank. "Good morning, I'd like to speak with Manager Claude, please. It's Helen Wilson." Minutes later, she was giving clear instructions. All joint accounts should be blocked immediately, credit cards suspended, and financial applications frozen. All according to Dr. Matthews' guidance and with the necessary legal documentation she had provided the previous week. "Are you sure, ma'am?" asked the manager, clearly uncomfortable. "This will cause a great inconvenience for your husband." "I am absolutely sure, Claude, and I appreciate your discretion in this matter." Next, she called Richard. "Son, can we meet for that coffee? I'm available now." Richard agreed, suggesting a cafe near his office. Helen carefully prepared for the meeting, separating some of the clearest evidence, enough to convince her son, but not so much that it would completely destroy him. When she arrived at the cafe, Richard was already waiting for her, looking worried. "Mom, what's going on? You've seemed different for weeks." Helen took a deep breath, holding her son's hands on the table. Richard, what I'm going to tell you will be difficult to hear, but I need you to trust me and listen to me until the end. In the next 30 minutes, Helen carefully explained what she had discovered. Anthony and Marcia's betrayal, the plan to defraud the division of assets, the systematic lies. She showed some bank statements, photographs of documents, and a particularly revealing recording where Anthony explicitly mentioned how they were deceiving the old lady, referring to her. Richard's face transformed as he absorbed each revelation. Disbelief, shock, anger, and finally a deep sadness. I can't believe it. He ran his hands over his face, suddenly looking older. My own father and Marcia. I'm sorry, son. Helen squeezed his hands. Believe me, I wanted to spare you from this. Richard remained silent for a few moments, processing everything. Then he raised his eyes to his mother, with a question that clearly tormented him. Do you think there's more between them than just this financial plan? Helen hesitated. The evidence suggested that yes, there was a deeper involvement, but she decided that revelation could wait. What matters now is that they were planning to deceive us both. She skillfully deflected. And we need to decide how to handle this. Richard nodded slowly. What do you intend to do? I'm going to confront them today. I've already taken legal measures to protect our assets, and I'd like you to be present. I don't know if I can, Mom. Richard shook his head, the pain evident in his eyes. I don't know if I can look at them right now. I understand, son. I won't force you. But I need you to stay with Beth this afternoon. I don't want her to be at home when this happens. Richard agreed, still stunned. Of course, I'll pick her up from school and take her to the movies, maybe to dinner afterward. I'll find a way to keep her distracted. As they said goodbye, Richard hugged his mother with an intensity he hadn't shown since childhood. I'm sorry, Mum. I should have noticed. It's not your fault, son. Helen stroked his hair as she did when he was little. They deceived all of us. Back home, Helen methodically organized all the evidence on the living room table. Each document, each photograph, each recording had its specific place in the narrative she would build. Beth's drawing occupied a central place, a constant reminder of what really mattered. At 2 in the afternoon, she received the first call from Anthony. She ignored it. At 2:15, another call. At 2:30, a message. Helen, what's happening with the accounts? Call me urgently. At 3 o'clock, the phone rang again. This time she answered. Helen? My God, what have you done? All our accounts are blocked. Are they? She kept her voice calm. How strange. There must be some mistake. Mistake? The manager said you gave the order. I need access to the money. I have important commitments today. Commitments like the ones you had last night, Helen asked softly. The ones that left the smell of cheap perfume on your shirt. A heavy silence on the other end of the line. What are you talking about? Anthony's voice now sounded cautious. I'm at home, Anthony. I think we need to talk. I'm in the middle of an important meeting. I'm sure you can postpone it, Helen interrupted firmly. Unless you prefer to discuss our matters with your lawyer present, that can also be arranged. Another silence, longer this time. I'll be there in 30 minutes. Helen hung up, feeling her heart speed up. The confrontation she had planned for weeks was about to happen. She breathed deeply, trying to calm herself. She couldn't show nervousness now. 20 minutes later, while she was reorganizing some documents, she heard a knock at the door. It wasn't Anthony. He would have used his key. When she opened it, she found Marcia standing on the porch with an expression of false concern. Helen, how good to find you at home. Richard told me you weren't feeling well. I came to see if you need anything. The lie flowed easily from her daughter-in-law's lips. Helen had to admire her audacity. Richard had certainly not said such a thing. How kind of you, Marcia. Helen opened the door wider. Please come in. Actually, your visit is very timely. Marcia entered, looking discreetly around as if searching for something or someone. Anthony isn't here, she asked casually. Not yet, but he will be soon. Helen indicated the sofa. Why don't you sit down? Would you like some coffee while we wait? Wait, Marcia frowned. I don't understand. You will in a moment. Helen smiled calmly. Oh, and you can put away your cell phone. You won't need it now. Marcia's expression hardened slightly, abandoning the facade of concern. What's going on, Helen? In response, Helen walked to the table, where she had arranged all the evidence. She picked up a folder and handed it to her daughter-in-law. "Why don't you take a look at this while I prepare the coffee?" Leaving a visibly disturbed Marcia leafing through the documents, Helen headed to the kitchen. Through the half-open door, she observed her daughter-in-law's expressions rapidly changing. Surprise, panic, despair. When she returned with 2 cups of coffee, Marcia was pale. This isn't what it looks like." "No." Helen sat calmly in the armchair opposite. "Then explain to me what it is, Marcia. Explain why you and my husband were planning a simulated separation to hide assets. Explain why you were secretly meeting when Richard was working. Explain why my granddaughter drew me crying, separated from the family." At the mention of Beth, Helen's voice trembled slightly, the only flaw in her perfectly controlled composure. Marcia opened her mouth to respond, but at that moment, the front door opened. Anthony entered hurriedly, stopping abruptly upon seeing Marcia sitting on the sofa. "What is she doing here?" he asked, his face suddenly livid. "Marcia kindly came to check if I needed anything," Helen replied, indicating the armchair beside her. "Please, join us, dear. We were about to have a very enlightening conversation." Anthony remained standing as if evaluating his options. Finally, he walked slowly to the indicated armchair. "Helen, I don't know what you think you've discovered, but let's save time, Anthony." Helen interrupted him, pointing to the table full of evidence. "I know everything. I know about the plan to deceive me. I know about the secret accounts. I know about the hidden properties. I know about the clandestine meetings." "You spied on us." The indignation in Anthony's voice would be comical if it weren't so pathetic. "I defended myself," Helen corrected, keeping her voice firm, "after accidentally overhearing you two planning to strip me of everything I've built over decades. It was just a misunderstanding." Marcia tried to intervene. Helen raised her hand, silencing her. "Don't insult my intelligence. I have recordings, Marcia. Recordings where you two explicitly discuss how you're going to deceive me." As if to prove her point, Helen pressed a button on the recorder on the table. Anthony's voice filled the room. "Helen will never find out. She's too naive, trusts me too much. When we realize I'm flirting with the receptionist, and that separation is the only option, she'll accept a much smaller division of assets than she's entitled to, and then, when the dust settles, we transfer everything back." Anthony visibly paled. Marcia sank into the sofa as if trying to disappear. "This is illegal," Helen continued calmly. "Defrauding the division of assets, hiding assets, falsifying documents, everything you were planning to do. My lawyer explained in detail the possible consequences." "Lawyer?" Anthony's voice failed. "You talked to a lawyer?" "Dr. Paul Matthews," Helen confirmed. "A highly respected specialist in family and criminal law. He is at this very moment, with copies of all this evidence." A heavy silence fell over the room. Helen could almost see the gears turning in Anthony's mind, desperately seeking a way out. "What do you want?" he finally asked, defeated. Helen looked directly into the eyes of the man with whom she had shared 4 decades of life. "I want justice, Anthony. Nothing more, nothing less." The process of Richard and Marcia's divorce was initiated the following week. To Helen's surprise, it was relatively amicable. Both seemed too exhausted for prolonged battles. The main concern was Beth, who was confused and frightened by the sudden changes. "Grandma, why doesn't Daddy live with Mommy anymore? Why did Grandpa leave?" she would ask during their weekly meetings, now held in the apartment Helen had temporarily rented. "Sometimes, dear, adults discover they can no longer live together," Helen patiently explained. "That doesn't mean they don't love you. We all love you very much." Helen insisted that Beth start therapy sessions, recognizing that the girl would need professional help to process the changes in her family. Richard immediately supported the idea, assuming a much more active role in his daughter's life than he had been able to during his marriage. "She's handling it better than we expected," commented the therapist after a few sessions. "Children are surprisingly resilient when they receive adequate support." 3 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Helen finally felt ready to truly start over. She moved to a small apartment near Beth's school, redecorated it with vibrant colors she had always wanted to use, but which Anthony considered extravagant, and decided to resume the private lessons that gave her so much pleasure. "Teacher Helen is back," she announced to a small group of parents of former students. Soon her schedule was filled with children eager to learn English in a fun and affectionate way. On a sunny Sunday afternoon, while helping Beth with an essay about real-life heroes, Helen received a call from Elise. "So, little sis, any suitors knocking at the door?" her sister teased, referring to the constant insinuations that Helen needed a man in her life. "Elise, please," Helen laughed, shaking her head. "I am perfectly fine alone. In fact, I'm better than I've been in years. Seriously, no secret passion, no romantic interest on the horizon. The only relationship I'm interested in now is with my granddaughter, my students, and of course, myself." Helen observed Beth concentrating on her essay. "I think I spent too much time defining my life in terms of another person. Now I'm learning to live for myself." The silence on the other end of the line was followed by a sigh of admiration. "You know, Helen, you've always been the sensible one in the family, the straight-laced one, the predictable one. But now you're my hero." After hanging up, Helen sat next to Beth, who raised her eyes from her notebook with a smile. "I finished, Grandma. Do you want to read it?" Helen took the notebook, adjusting her glasses. At the top of the page, in colorful letters, was the title, "My Grandmother, My Hero." Her granddaughter's words, simple but deeply sincere, described a woman who, even when she's sad, finds strength to smile, who teaches that we can be strong and gentle at the same time, and who showed that it's never too late to start over. With tears in her eyes, Helen hugged her granddaughter. "It's perfect, my love. Absolutely perfect." That night, after putting Beth to bed, the girl now spent alternate weekends with her, Helen sat on the balcony of her new apartment, watching the stars. In her hand, the drawing Beth had made months ago, the grandmother crying, separated from the family. Next to it, a new drawing, made that same day. Helen at the center, holding hands with Beth and Richard, all smiling under a colorful sky. The betrayal that had almost destroyed her had ironically liberated her. The tears she had shed had irrigated a new garden of possibilities. Pain had transformed into strength and loss into a new beginning. Helen carefully put the drawings in a special folder. Tomorrow would be a new day of classes, of laughter with her granddaughter, of sincere conversations with her son. A day she would face not as a victim of betrayal, but as the author of her own story. The greatest lesson she had learned, after all, had not come from the books she had taught for decades, but from life itself. True love begins with self-respect, and true strength is born from the ability to transform pain into wisdom. Looking at the starry sky, Helen smiled. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem frightening. It seemed promising. The end. Dear listeners, we hope Helen's story has deeply touched your hearts. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special playlist with equally engaging stories. Find it here by clicking on the left. If this narrative of overcoming and new beginnings touched you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a like. Every day we bring unique stories that explore life's complexity and the surprising strengths we find within ourselves in the most difficult moments. Share in the comments if you've witnessed or experienced a story of overcoming similar to Helen's. We're eager to hear about your experiences. Dr. Matthews gathered the signed documents, carefully storing them in his briefcase. "I'll file these papers tomorrow, Mrs. Helen. The divorce should be finalized in a few weeks, considering it's consensual." "Thank you, Doctor." Helen accompanied him to the door, along with Patricia. "You were incredible," whispered the former student, squeezing her hand. "Our true warrior." When the two left, Helen returned to the living room where Anthony still remained seated, suddenly looking old and fragile. "How long do I have to remove my things?" he asked, his voice devoid of emotion. "Until the end of the week," Helen responded, surprising herself with her own calmness. "I suggest you find a hotel for now." Anthony nodded slowly, getting up. For a moment it seemed he was going to say something more, perhaps an apology, a final justification, but he just picked up his jacket and walked toward the door. "You know what's most ironic?" Helen asked, making him stop. "If you had simply honestly asked for a divorce, I would have agreed. We would have divided everything fairly without resentment. It was the betrayal, the dishonesty, that made all this necessary." Anthony didn't respond. He opened the door and left, leaving behind not just a house, but 4 decades of shared history. Helen remained motionless in the center of the living room, feeling the silence of the empty house for the first time. There were no tears, no emotional collapse, just a strange sensation of lightness, as if an enormous weight had been removed from her shoulders. In the weeks that followed, life reorganized itself into new patterns. The divorce was quickly finalized thanks to the signed agreement. Anthony moved to the beach apartment, avoiding contact with his ex-wife and maintaining only formal communications through lawyers. The situation between Richard and Marcia proved equally irreconcilable. A week after the confrontation, he appeared at Helen's door with a small suitcase and red eyes. "She confessed everything, Mum," he said, accepting the cup of tea Helen offered him. "Not just the financial plan, but the rest too." Helen nodded in silence, allowing her son to process his pain at his own pace. "How was I so blind?" he continued, running his hands through his hair. "The signs were all there, the frequent meetings, the secret calls, the distance. Sometimes we don't see what's right in front of us because it would be too painful to admit," Helen responded softly. "Believe me, I understand that better than anyone." Richard looked at his mother with a new understanding. "You're stronger than all of us, you know that?" A small smile curved Helen's lips. "Not stronger, just determined."